Welcome back to another video series or part of our video series for the Marianne Key Book Club, connected to Hennepin County Library, friends of the Hennepin County Library, also sponsored by the Star Tribune. I'm Myron Medcalf, the founder of that book club, and I'm happy to be joined by Matthew F. Delmont, uh, author of Half American. I'm saying the name probably, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Author of Half American, also someone who has some Midwest ties as well. And it's a book that speaks to the plight of World War II soldiers, Black World War II soldiers. And essentially, I guess as I read it, seeking a sense of validation and just telling the story and the reality that the experiences weren't universal for the soldiers who served. Matthew, thank you for joining us. For you, what was the inspiration, I guess, behind this book and wanting to write about World War II soldiers and their experiences as African Americans?
Thanks so much for having me, Myron. And I am from the Twin Cities. Grew up downtown Minneapolis, 13th and
Yeah,
Nicollet at Nicollet Towers, then moved out to Bloomington for high school. So it's really
nice.
great to have a chance to be part of this book club, even though it's virtual. I'm out in New Hampshire now.
Yeah,
So for me, I'm a historian. I teach at Dartmouth College, and all my work is about African American history in different ways, usually World War II and afterwards. But this book project I started about 7 years ago. And actually came to it through Black newspapers. I was doing research on Black newspapers like Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, looking at those newspapers at different points in history to try to just get a better sense of how different Black communities were experiencing history as it unfolded. And what struck me is when I was looking at the newspapers from the World War II years during the 1940s, I kept coming across pictures and stories about Black men and women in military service. And these weren't famous people. These were average Black soldiers and sailors, Marines from New York, from Chicago, from Minneapolis, from Los Angeles. These were names that I wasn't familiar with, names that aren't in our history textbooks, and certainly names I wasn't teaching my students about in the classroom. And at first I came across hundreds of these, and eventually thousands of these examples. And it made me curious. I wanted to know what more there was to the story. What wasn't I sharing with my students, and what more could I bring to different readers and different audiences? And so it was really that curiosity that sparked my interest that led to the research that resulted in Half American. I wanted to get a better understanding of what the war looked like from the Black perspective.
there's so many fascinating, I think, components of this book. The journalism nerd that I am, this idea that some of those Black publications, like the Chicago Defender, had their pulse on kind of what was transpiring across the ocean, and also the experiences of African American soldiers and some of the things that they were, I guess, participating in, but they weren't necessarily acknowledged for, such as the Spanish Civil War. You start the book with that story. What were those experiences like for the African American soldiers who were involved in a global conflict before America actually declared to World War II?
Yeah, Black newspapers are such amazing historical sources. And I tried, as a historian, to really follow the sources, tried to structure the story around what I was seeing in these primary sources. And so when you look at the war from the Black perspective, you have to start the story before 1941. Usually, as Americans, we start the story Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. But for Black Americans, the story started nearly a decade earlier than that. If you look at Black newspapers, you'll see as early as 1933 extensive coverage of the rise of fascism in Europe. They were talking about Adolf Hitler and talking about the rise of the Nazi regime. Black Americans understood what a dire threat Hitler posed much earlier than a lot of other Americans did, because they understood that racial ideology was really a flip side of what was going on in the US. That Hitler was explicitly drawing on Jim Crow policies to justify his treatment of Jews in Europe. Fast forward a couple of years, 1935, when the Spanish Civil War starts, that too galvanizes Black Americans all over the country, because they see this as a fight that they need to be paying attention to. They know it's not going to be confined just to Europe. The famous poet and writer Langston Hughes became a war correspondent for the Baltimore African American. He actually traveled to Spain and was on the front lines reporting on Black volunteers. There was a group of about 80 Black volunteers that joined a brigade called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, a group of American volunteers that volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And so here already by 1937, 38, you have these average Black Americans who've uprooted their lives, traveled to a country they've never even been to before to fight against fascism. Several of them went on to serve in World War II, with the U.S. One woman I read about is named Celeria Key. She was originally from Akron, Ohio, was a nurse in Harlem. She joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and she was the only Black nurse there. She served on the front lines in Spain and then became a nurse in the U.S. Army during World War II. And so one of the things the book tries to do is really change our chronology for how we talk about World War II, try to start the story earlier and give a clear sense of how the sense of urgency that Black Americans understood with regards to the fight against fascism.
What I love about the book is I think sort of there's this concept of patriotism and who is patriotic. And I think a lot of that is conceptualized around this idea of sort of an effort, a loyalty, a desire to represent and love your country. Obviously, this was a far more complicated experience for Black soldiers in World War II. And I think what was really fascinating is you talk about those who were rejected, those who wanted to fight, but were essentially barred from that because of Jim Crow, because of racism. What was patriotism like for those soldiers, and how did they see their role in fighting for their country with all of those other components impacting their daily lives here in America?
One thing Black people knew during World War II, in the same way we know it now, is that Black Americans have served in every military conflict the United States has ever been a part of. The American Revolution, the Civil War, the World War I. There were 300,000 Black Americans that served in World War I. But between World War I and World War II, the military did almost everything they could to push Black Americans out of military service. And so in the lead up to World War II, one of the first things that civil rights activists and Black newspaper editors have to do is fight for the right to fight. It almost seems paradoxical at a time that the United States is preparing for this massive global conflict. They really didn't want to include Black Americans in the fight. And so that sense of patriotism, it really took an active campaign to force the military to establish all Black units to accommodate all the Black Americans that wanted to serve. In those days and weeks after Pearl Harbor, there were thousands of Black Americans that went to volunteer for military service, but hundreds were turned away because of the color of their skin. At that point, the Army and the Navy didn't yet have enough all Black units to accommodate them, and they were just left dumbfounded. They asked, what's wrong with us? What's wrong with our desire to serve our country that you won't even accept us into military service? And so the book tries to trace that story, the desire of Black Americans to fight for a country that wasn't treating them as full citizens. They were hoping that through military service, through the desire to defend the country, it would lead to more equality on the other side. And for me, it's a powerful story. I think we're at a kind of moment politically where it's easy to think of patriotism and dissent as being opposite sides of a political spectrum, but that's never been true for Black Americans. In World War II, especially, for Black people, they saw patriotism and dissent as intertwined. People wanted to fight for their country, but they also wanted to fight to make America a different kind of country. And so on the later part of the book, I talk about those Black veterans coming back, and they never stop fighting. They just keep pushing for America to be a true democracy.
I wonder about the experience attached to what you just said, where you have these Black Americans who, by fighting for your country, is about as American as you can get. In their eyes, they get involved in this global conflict that obviously changes the course of humanity. And then they also see that they don't have equality. And matter of fact, I mean, your book points out that some of the people who were in Nazi war camps had elements where they were treated better than the Black soldiers. What was it like for these individuals to feel like, okay, finally, maybe I'm part of something that will showcase a glimpse of equality and fairness, and to learn that that was not the case?
That really speaks to the title of the book. So I took the title of the book from a letter that was written by a man named James G. Thompson. He was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas. And it's after Pearl Harbor, late December 1941. He writes this amazing letter to the Pittsburgh Courier. He asked in part, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? It really stuck with me. It's why I chose Half American as the title of the book. Thompson was asking a question that was on the minds of Black people all across the country during World War II. What does it mean to fight for, potentially die for a country that treats you as a second-class citizen? The Pittsburgh Courier used Thompson's letter to launch what was called the Double Victory Campaign, which was really the rallying cry for Black Americans during the war. It stood for fighting for both victory over fascism abroad, but also victory over racism at home. And I don't think I really got it until I started working on the book, that it wasn't just a rhetorical device or a slogan, but it really structured how Black people experienced the war. It really, truly was a true front battle. They were absolutely committed to helping to win the war militarily, but they were equally committed to fighting these battles on the home front to achieve freedom and democracy here in the United States. And so person by person for Black soldiers, sailors, and then eventually for veterans, they saw that as something that they were willing to risk their lives for, in some cases, give their lives for. I think maybe the best example is Medgar Evers, the famous civil rights activist. He was a part of a group called the Red Ball Express. He loaded cargo for Black truck drivers that moved supplies after D-Day. Medgar Evers' unit landed on Omaha Beach just days after June 6th, just days after D-Day. He described that experience being in war and moving across France as being profound for him. It was the first time when he engaged with white people in France, the first time he ever felt like he was treated as a full human being was when he was at war. When he came back from the war, he dedicated himself to fighting for civil rights. On his 21st birthday in 1946, he led a group of Black veterans who tried to register to vote in his hometown of Decatur, Mississippi, but they were turned away by a white mob with guns. That was in 46. For those next 15 years, he just takes on increasingly important roles in the NAACP in Mississippi until he's eventually assassinated in 1963. But I think Medgar Evers' story is indicative and illustrative of the story of thousands and thousands of Black veterans. These men and women gave everything they could to help the country win the war, but they recognized the war wasn't over in 1945. They didn't want to come back to a country that treated them as half American. So they came back to the United States, to communities all across the country, and kept fighting. They became leaders in the civil rights movement in the decades after World War II.
You talk about, again, individuals coming home and almost being reinvigorated, if you will, or encouraged by some of their experience. What do you think the impact of the European engagement and being in places where they were treated as equal citizens in a lot of ways, even though that wasn't happening within the military, even though that wasn't happening back home? How do you think that impacted them as they return home?
They described it as a breath of fresh air. I don't want to say there wasn't racism in Europe. There absolutely was. Those European countries had colonies, and so Black Americans were aware of that. But the way that they were treated as Americans. They were treated as soldiers. They were treated as equal human beings. And it was the small day-to-day things. They could go to whatever pub they wanted to, eat wherever they wanted to, dance with whomever they wanted to. They didn't have to step off the sidewalk when a white person passed. The kind of indignities that they experienced throughout the Jim Crow South and even in northern and Midwestern cities, they didn't have those same kind of indignities in Europe. They, again, described it as like a breath of fresh air. Statistically, one of the best examples we have is that Black Americans agreed to re-up for the military at a much higher percentage because they wanted the opportunity to stay in Europe after the war. They preferred staying in France or in Great Britain than coming back to the South just because they were treated that much better there. And so it really opened up their eyes to what was possible. Obviously, the civil rights movement started well before World War II. Black people have always been fighting for freedom in the United States, but it helped to energize it and really increase a sense of urgency and increase a sense of possibility. They realized that there were ways that they could be treated, that they could demand respect, demand equality, that they should be able to do that in their hometowns just as much as in these foreign countries.
I always think it's interesting when you hear people talk about the wealth gap and discrepancies in home ownership between whites and blacks and educational disparities and all these things, and don't recognize what the GI Bill and its role and just what it did for those soldiers who returned from World War II and starting families and getting houses and employment and education, all these other elements. But so many Black soldiers were barred from gaining those same benefits. What was the impact of that on these soldiers who had risked their entire lives, had lost brothers in war, brothers and sisters in war, and had returned home, not only to a place that wasn't equal for them, but also wasn't giving them what they were promised, what they had earned, and the benefits of being an American soldier who had fought in the war?
The impact was profound. For viewers who aren't familiar, the GI Bill is one of the most important pieces of legislation in the 20th century. And so it made it possible for a whole generation of white veterans to be able to move into the middle class because it provided access to low-interest home mortgages, access to college tuition benefits, access to loans to be able to start small businesses. It truly did make home ownership possible, make owning a business possible, make going to college possible for an entire generation. And then they were able to pass on that wealth to future generations. By and large, Black veterans weren't able to benefit from the GI Bill, and that discrimination was by design. As that legislation was being crafted, Southern segregationist politicians controlled the key committees that it went through, and they made sure that those benefits were going to be distributed at the state and local level rather than at the federal level. And everyone at the time understands what that means in 1945. If you do things at the state level, it means you're deferring to the prejudices and policies of Southern states. And that's how it played out. Black veterans were disproportionately not able to access those GI Bill benefits. They couldn't buy homes at the same rate, couldn't go to college at the same rate, couldn't be able to start the business at the same rate. There's a group of economists at Brandeis University that have tried to calculate what the long-term impact of that discrimination was. And what they found is, on average, Black World War II veterans received about $125,000 less than white World War II veterans did. And so when you think about the vast racial wealth gap we have in our country today, a good portion of that can be traced back to the GI Bill. And I think one important thing to note is there were thousands of Black veterans who were able to access the GI Bill, particularly outside of the South. And a lesson we can take from that is they did amazing things. They became doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers. They created wealth for their families that they were able to pass on to future generations. And so I think there was really an opportunity cost to the country based on this discrimination. We could have had a whole other generation, a much larger generation of Black professionals coming out of World War II, because those Black veterans who could access the benefits, they did amazing things just like the white veterans did. And I think that's a story that sometimes gets lost, that absolutely there was discrimination. But I think we can also learn something from those who were able to access those benefits, because they did just remarkable things in the decades after the war.
The book is Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. Matthew F. Delmont. My last sort of question is, I mean, I'm a big war buff. I watch a lot of documentaries, read a lot of books. You don't see the Black experience separated in many ways. It's sort of just kind of stitched in by the spoonful, if you will, oftentimes in stories about white veterans. Why is it so important to tell the story that you're telling, to acknowledge the experiences of African-American veterans in one of the most important wars of our time?
And for me, it's really two things. The first is to try to do justice to that generation that fought in the war. More than 1 million Black men and women served the country during World War II, and they haven't gotten the recognition that they've deserved. There are only a few thousand who are still with us today, but their stories and legacies deserve to live on. And more than anything else, that's what motivated me to write the book. I wanted to make sure that future generations know this history, appreciate the history, and celebrate the history. But then the other thing is, when we think about World War II, obviously there are thousands and thousands of books that have been written on the war, many, many amazing ones. My goal wasn't just to sprinkle in a handful of new Black names, but to really encourage us to rethink some of our foundational assumptions about the war. For a lot of Americans, we think about World War II as being the good war. It wasn't in many ways. When you think about the actual evidence from World War II, America was a very fraught place during the war. There were racial conflicts all across the country. When you focus on Black Americans at the center of the story, it gives us an opportunity to reckon honestly with what the history of the war was actually about. And I think if we can do that, we'll be better positioned to understand why so many of those issues from the 1940s and 50s are still with us today, and why it's important for us to talk honestly about the history if we want to have a better chance of moving forward in the future.
He's Matthew F. Delmont, Twin Cities native, half American. Please go out and read the book. It's incredible. Definitely thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Great talking to you.